Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. I am your host, Phil Hawkins, along with my other host.
Hello, I'm Azaii Calderon-Muniz, and we are excited to have you back joining us.
Yeah, that was a good entrance. You were good on your timing.
I see what you did there.
There we go. So today we want to talk about timing. And timing means a lot of things. Timing as you're taking the exam, timing as like the entire length of the exam, because that's kind of an interesting thing. Most students aren't taking 7.5 hour long exams on a regular basis until they get to the MCAT. And all of a sudden they have to deal with like, how do I just keep up with this? But let's start at the small. Let's start at the kind of like the narrow little bit, just looking at like the amount of time to spend on a question or in a section or in a passage. So Azaii, what's your view on that?
Yeah. So if you take the number of questions, right, and the time that you have for the entire section, you'll end up spending about 1.5 minutes on each question. Now, that does include read time, right? That includes the time that you're reading the passage. And so that's the first mistake that some students make is that they'll take that number and they'll say, okay, I have 1.5 minutes to answer each question, right? That's not quite right. So you need to figure out how long it takes you to read a passage, right? And to engage in the passage in a way that you'll remember the information, that you get the important information out of that passage, and then determine the amount of time that you'll spend on a question beyond that. Now, I like to aim for about a minute-ish for the actual question so that I have a few minutes to read the passage, recognizing that, if I get a passage that is very detailed, right, it's going to take me a little bit longer to read that versus if I'm reading a passage that is a bit more textbook style, I'm going to go through that a little bit faster. So you'll often hear that number thrown around, right? 1.5 minutes. Just keep in mind that takes into account read time.
Yeah, that also, it's important to recognize that you should be thinking in terms of averages, not like, because some questions you will finish in 30 seconds or 20 seconds. Some passages you will finish reading in 2 minutes or maybe 5 minutes. And I think it's really important to understand that not all passages are created equal. Everyone wants to be given like a time frame of like, this is how long I should work on this passage and on this passage and on this question. And I should be at this point by this time on the clock. And you can do that, but you need to keep in mind that those are like generalities. Those are not the like set in stone by you should be at this question by this time frame. But speaking like overall, like you're exactly right. Like on average, about 1.5 minutes per question, but that doesn't include read time. And it's 230 questions. So that's why the exam takes forever. There are some things that are kind of set in stone, like the science sections, the Chem Phys, Bio, Psych, Soc, all of them have discretes. Those should go a little bit faster than like a passage should, because you got to read the passage and then answer the questions. So I agree with you. Generally, I shoot for about 1 minute per question. Cars, there isn't any discretes. It's just the passages. So you have your passages and you have the amount of time. As I just chime in here, what's the number of questions or number of passages?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask how the amount of time for a car.
Oh, yeah.
So very quickly, before I forget that, so you should be spending aim for about 10 minutes for a cars passage, less time for science, closer to 8 to 9 minutes for science. So for cars, you have 53 questions for the 90-minute span. And then for the sciences, you have 59 for 95 minutes. But keeping in mind, like Phil said, that you have discrete questions that are standalones. So they don't include any associated passage. Like he mentioned, those should go by a little bit faster. You either know them or you don't. There is generally less in-depth reasoning because you're not referring back to a passage, you're integrating less information.
Yeah. Although I have seen a discrete question every once in a while that's like, "Ooh, man, that's really tricky and requires kind of a lot of work trying to get through that." But I know we talked about this a little bit last time about sometimes students, spend way too much time on a question or a passage. And I don't let me forget, I do want to loop back around to the 10-minute per passage thing in cars. But for like the amount of time per question. Whoa, there we go. My phone's talking to me. Probably need to edit that. So when it comes to the amount of time per question, you want to spend about a minute per question, but no more than like 2 minutes. Generally, what I've seen is if a student spends more than 2 minutes per question, then they're going to miss that question. They're more likely to miss it than get it if they've spent more than 2 minutes on that one question. And that means, and also I'll see this often where a student will spend 5 minutes on a question and then like not get to 2 or 3 questions that they could have easily gotten if they just would have skipped that one question. So knowing when to cut and run is, I think, really important. If you've spent like more than a couple minutes on a question, take a step back and kind of, like just move past it, mark it, move on. I do think, especially if you're taking practice exams, those questions that you spent a lot of time on, you need to pay a lot more attention to when you're reviewing. Even if you got them right, you need to stop and ask yourself, was there a way for me to get through this question faster? Was there like some shortcut to this? Because very often there's things, I like to call them back doors, where there's like another way to answer this question. Like you could go through and do this big, long calculation question, or you could realize that C is the only answer that makes remote sense. Like blood has got to be about the density of water, and they're asking me about the density of blood, so the answer's got to be C because that's the only one that's even close to the density of water. And like that's a valid way to answer a question. And that's important to understand. But there's a lot of students that'll do a bunch of buoyancy questions trying to calculate this. That's always why when I'm like teaching and going through exams and materials with students, I very often will like look at a question on an AAMC exam or the section bank, and I'll be like, okay, here's one way to answer this. Here's the right way in quotations. And now here are 2 other ways to solve this. And notice that one of these is like really fast. And so being on the lookout for those shortcuts, even if you got the question right, like when you're reviewing and when you go back and see like, oh, I spent 3 minutes on this question and not including reading the passage, like that should be sending off little alarm bells in your head that like there must be a faster way to solve this than whatever I was doing. And let me see if I can find that.
Yeah. And I like to use the rule of thumb I like to use is if I'm spending more than about 30 seconds just with, spending my time really poorly, bashing my head, right, metaphorically against the wall, rereading the question stem, still have absolutely no idea what it's asking. Look at the answer choices. My mind is blanking. It's time to move on, right? Mm-hmm. Because like we talked about this during our last podcast, right? We could sit there and like you just mentioned, we could sit there, we could try and wait to see if the answer suddenly comes upon us. But the chances of that are slimmer, right? And the more time that goes on, the more likely it is that we're going to get that question wrong, because now we run into the possibility of overthinking, right? And so that's a road that you do not want to go down for the purposes of the MCAT in general. You don't want to, start overthinking, but definitely not for the MCAT. And so some students will say, okay, well, how am I supposed to know what 30 seconds feels like? I didn't realize that I spent 5 minutes on that question. It's not that I'm trying to take that much time, but I don't have a good sense of time. So depending on how early you are in your studying, something that you can do that is a little obnoxious, but quite helpful is to set a timer. So set a timer for 30 seconds, set a timer for 45 seconds, for a minute, and for a minute and a half, and get a sense of what that feels like when you're answering a question, right? Do this when, you are not taking a timed section. Do this when you are not, doing any sorts of timed practice like that. But when you're just looking at a passage, you have a little bit of extra time, set that timer, see what it feels like.
I love that advice. Like I wouldn't do that necessarily during an exam, but like, do like a daily passage. Like Jack Westin, we put out a passage like every day. We put out a couple of stuff in the sciences and in the cars, and just do that for a passage, right? And just kind of see that. It won't take long. A couple of passages, you'll start to get a good idea of that. And I think that will help.
So for some folks, they might say, well, every passage counts, right? Even though we do send out a lot of, practice passages. There's no shortage of that. If you're really concerned about, wasting, which is not wasting, but wasting, right? If you can't see me and if you're listening to us, I just use quotations. So you can use that on the foundational questions, right? It doesn't have to be specific to a passage question. The whole point is just to get a sense of time. So that way you can tell when you're using more time on a question than you should be.
Yeah. Now, one thing I want to be kind of careful, and I have to be really careful what I'm talking about now, because I'm going to talk about some other companies and some prep materials. And this has nothing to do necessarily with selling, but I just want to be like talking about what's going on in the best interest of students. So the old MCAT, the pre-2015 MCAT, which like the new MCAT isn't even that new anymore. The old MCAT, you had 8 minutes per passage in the science or in the reading section. And so the passages were shorter. They were a little bit easier to read. The questions were a little bit simpler. And then you guys all got too smart. And so the MCAT turned up the difficulty and was like, okay, now these passages are harder. And so it takes 10 minutes per passage is the average on the new MCAT. There are some companies out there that had a lot of practice material written beforehand, and the sciences didn't really change. The cars changed a little bit in terms of like the rationale and the reasoning. That didn't really change, but the length changed a little bit. So the old passages were designed to be done in 8 minutes, the new ones in 10. And they had invested a lot of money, like hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in writing these passages, and they didn't want to throw them away. And so I know that there are some companies out there whose practice materials, especially in the reading sections, are a little bit too short and simple. And if you practice just with those and nothing else, you might find that you are running like you're actually going slower than you should be. And so that then when you show up in the actual test and the passages are a whole lot more complex and you've been practicing with 8-minute passages and you've been giving yourself 10 minutes, all of a sudden it doesn't work. The reason I bring this up, I've met with several students in the past that have gone through this where they never ran out of time in cars. And then all of a sudden the day of their test, they did. And it's because of the materials that they were using to practice. Now you can use lots of practice materials from lots of different sources, but you should always be using the AAMC resources as a part of that because they're the ones who create the actual exam. And so be using their stuff. And if you are going to do additional extra practice, I recommend doing stuff that is from a newer company or at least newer material. There are some companies out there that have been around for decades and decades, and I think that some of their car stuff could use a revamp. At least as of a couple of years ago, they certainly could in terms of timing. I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to get in trouble. And I might get in trouble for bringing this up anyway, but I do think students should be aware of this because this is a problem that I've seen in the past with students practicing with timing. As long as you're using the AAMC resources, you should be fine. Note that all of our stuff has been rewritten here at Jack Westin and for like the recent modern exam. But if all else fails, you should be using the AAMC stuff because they're the ones who write the actual exam, and all of their stuff is revamped for their new stuff. They're not using any of their old things. I'm going to do an asterisk for cars, especially is the asterisk. So that's something to be aware of and just be kind of careful of.
And when you're using those AMC materials, so here at Jack Westin, we've actually put out a Chrome extension that you can use for the advanced solutions. So we've actually gone ahead and written solutions that will hopefully address, why each answer choice is correct or why an answer choice is incorrect. And so take advantage of that as well. It's, a resource that is available to anyone who has Chrome, right? And that means, Windows and Mac users alike. So something to keep in mind. And something else that I like doing is, have resources that you are going to use like Phil mentioned, whether or not you're strictly using AMC or whether you're supplementing, have a set amount that you're going to do timed, right? You should not be in a situation where all of your AMC practice is untimed until you get to the full length. That is not a situation you want to find yourself in, because then you actually don't have, as representative an idea of what to expect on test day. So it's not just which materials you use, it's also how you use them, making sure that you're using them effectively so that you can have solid timing come test day and you're not freaking out. You don't encounter that, well, I did all of the AMC material, why am I still running out of time, right? Did you practice with a timed, or with a timer? Did you do that sort of practice? So that's something to keep in mind. But then we also recognize that there will be moments where you do go through a passage and you do run out of time, right? And so keeping in mind, and I think we've already hinted at this, the numbers that we're giving you are averages, right? So that means that some passages are going to feel a lot easier, regardless of, what section they're in, and some are going to feel more difficult and they're going to take you a little bit longer. So when you're doing timed practice on your own, maybe you're doing 1 or 2 passages, keep that in the back of your mind. Did you run out of time because you have a fundamental timing problem, or did you run out of time because this was a really difficult passage and it's going to take you an extra minute or 2, right? So this is where keeping track of, how long it takes you to do a few passages at a time can be really helpful. You don't want to have reached test date and have only ever done 1 timed passage at a time, except for full lengths.
Right. Also, like a really good idea is to find, if you finish like a section or a practice exam or something and you did run out of time, go back and find where that time went. Did you spend too long reading every single passage? Or was there like 2 or 3 questions that like, oh, these 3 questions, I spent 5 minutes on each of them. So that was a quarter of an hour that I spent on those 3 questions out of the like 59. That's not a good use of time, especially if that means you didn't get to a passage at the end. I think that's really crucial, is like understand where the time goes, and to like find that you have to look for it. I think very often when students are reviewing exams, they're just looking at like, what was the right answer? Why was I wrong? What's wrong with this answer? And they're not thinking about like how they're taking the test and how to kind of like work on that. So paying a little bit more attention to where that time goes. I know the AAMC, I believe that I'm fairly certain, with like 99% certain, that they give you the amount of time that you spent on a question. You do have to be careful, because if it was the first question of a passage and you read the passage and answered the question, it's going to say you spent a lot of time on that question. But really, most of that was just reading the passage. So I do think that you need to be aware of that and look for those sorts of things. Do you have anything else you wanted to add on like timing, like per question or per passage or things like that?
Yes, to all my rereaders out there,
No.
pause, stop, do not pass go. So I was definitely someone who, when I was reading through a passage and I felt, like I was stuck, I, didn't really understand what was going, I would start reading again. And I'm also the kind of person, even now in medical school, hopefully none of my professors hear this, I'll start reading the prep or whatnot, and I will zone off. Right. So that's something where for the purposes, for the MCAT, you really have to work on that. Right. Because the last thing you want is to be reading a passage and your mind have gone somewhere else. And now, oh no, I don't remember the last 2 paragraphs that I read. I have to go back and reread it. And so that will also show up, Phil, like you mentioned, on that first question of the passage, because that's where that time will increase. So if you notice that question is, 7-8 minutes, that's probably an issue with rereading, things like that. Maybe, the strategy you're using is just not time efficient for you. And so making sure that it's not just, okay, I spent a lot of time on that question, next, right? It's why did I spend a lot of time on that question? Or, right, also calculations. So this is a very big plug for know your math, know your basic math skills, very helpful, something that I also probably could have worked on earlier. These are the little things that they feel like they take up too much time now, but they will help your timing throughout the study process, make you more efficient when you're studying, and then also help you, retain that efficiency on test day. So better to spend the time up front, getting all of these smaller things, so to speak, out of the way, and then building your strategy from there. And then something else that, maybe you can also touch on is students will have a tendency to want to get their time right first, and then their strategy second. And that's not a good use of your time either, because if I am suddenly, or not suddenly, but let's say I make my way to a 10-minute CARS passage, and then I have realized, oh, wait, I'm not actually getting the score I want on this 10-minute CARS passage, right? Now I have to figure out my strategy, but now my strategy changes my timing. So now I have to go back and figure out how to adjust my timing to match my new strategy. So that's something else. It's, timing with respect to the passage, but also what you're prioritizing first.
Yeah, I have so many things to talk about there. Like so many ideas like showed up in my mind based on what you were talking. I absolutely agree with work timing should come second. Imagine that, but my analogy of this, imagine that you were trying to decorate a cake as beautiful as like a wedding cake, beautifully in under 10 minutes. And that was your goal, to be able to do that over the next like 3 months. What I'm not going to do is try to like, all my effort is going to be done in 10-minute cakes, right? Like that's not how you do this. Like what you do is you decorate a cake beautifully once, and then again and again. And the more you do it, the faster you get. And so you want to work on developing those skills, and timing will come as you get better at those skills. If you are trying to work on timing and the skills simultaneously, that really doesn't work. Now, this advice is especially for students that are just starting out, is, focus on the skills first, timing secondarily. Generally for the first, third or the first fourth or third of a student's prep, I'm telling them not to worry about timing at all. Just work on developing the right skills, know how to answer this, how to study, how to get through all of this material. A couple of other things. You talked about if you found your time kind of disappearing in a certain passage. Maybe it was like rereading, and maybe it was the way that the passage was written, but it might also be the topic of the passage. Maybe you're just not comfortable with it. I personally, I know I'm in the minority here, but I actually kind of like the philosophical passages. I hate anything political or history. I'm just like not interested. A passage about existentialism is way more interesting to me than like what happened in Peru in the 70s. That probably is not the way it should be. And I know that's not how it is for most people, but that's just the way I'm more interested in certain topics. And if you're more interested in a topic, you're going to pay more attention as you're reading it. So look for that. Find out which topics you are less comfortable with and practice more with those sorts of passages. I know that at Jack Westin, you can specifically select certain types of passages to practice with those specifically, which is something that didn't exist when I was first prepping for the MCAT, but I wished it would have, because I would have done all of the politically politics related ones. Do you have anything to say about that? Because I have another thing that I want to talk about that you kind of
just super quickly. So for those of you who are like me and we're not huge fans of the philosophy ones, if you can find a way to get engaged with a passage, it will make it go by faster, right? So something, and we'll definitely talk all about this later on, but something that I found helpful is, okay, it's opportunity to learn something new, right? So I'm going to go ahead, take advantage of that. And that way I can get myself interested in these types of passages, even when I'm not super interested, so that I can go through it a little bit faster. But we'll talk plenty about that.
No, like what you're talking about is what I wanted to segue into. The other thing you talked about was the reading and rereading and like struggling. My analogy for this is, imagine that you have a giant brick wall in front of you, which is pretty easy for you and me because we have brick walls. But imagine like you as a student, you have like a huge brick wall, and your job is to stare at this brick wall for 10 minutes. And if you think about anything else, if you think about like, oh, my foot hurts, or I want lunch, or something like what's for lunch, you're dead. Like a lightning bolt comes from the sky and hits you. So you have to look at the wall and you have to think just about the wall for 10 minutes. Everyone's dead, right? Like most people are not going to be able to make it through this. And the reason is that your brains, and it's not your brain specifically, it's human brains, we need to be engaged with something. And so you were talking about like, treat it like I'm trying to learn something new. Absolutely. I do something a little bit more abstract because there are certain topics that I just don't care about. And like, I wish I did, but there are certain things I'm just not interested in. And so the way that I do it, the way that I keep engaged, is I'm looking for certain things. I'm looking for certain keywords, and I change it from, instead of me reading about this passage, I'm hunting for keywords. And so like an analogy to that would be like, oh, instead of staring at the wall and just thinking about the wall in general, like I'm counting the number of dark red bricks and the number of light red bricks, and like the number, like what's the biggest clumping of dark red bricks that are all connected. And like you could stare at that wall and think about those things, like counting bricks and doing those things. You could do that for maybe 30 minutes, right? And each CARS passage is kind of like that. There's this wall of information that most of you guys don't really care about that much. And that's not a slight on you. It's just these passages are not, chosen because they're the most interesting things. They're chosen because they're weird, difficult, hard to read, got to pull everything apart. And so having a task, having a challenge, something to keep you engaged, kind of making it more of a game, makes it easier. This is something I did in med school. I had multiple highlighters, and like all diseases I would highlight in red, all symptoms would be in yellow, all treatments would be in blue. And so I'm like looking for these things so I can like color them, and that keeps me engaged. So I'm not reading and rereading the same paragraph over and over again and like just not paying attention and kind of glazing over. I think everyone's had that thing happen where they like, I read 10 pages of this textbook and I don't remember any of it, right? It's just because they weren't engaged. And like giving your brain a task will help you stay engaged. Also, if you can make it so, for me, I'm looking for those like contrast and opinion stuff, because not only does it keep me engaged, but that also tends to be what the questions are about. And so it's keeping me engaged and helping me answer questions. So it's kind of a double whammy of usefulness.
Yeah, and I think that also addresses stamina, right? That I mean, we've mentioned a couple times, this is a 7.5 hour exam, right? It is not for the faint of heart. And so it's really easy to find yourself exhausted if you're not careful. And one way to make sure that, or to, make it less likely to happen is to stay engaged as much as possible. And a lot of students will say, well, how am I supposed to do that? Right? Like, I don't want to sit here for 7.5 hours taking this exam. I want to go home and be done with the MCAT. But if you go ahead and you say, okay, I'm hunting, as Phil said, for these ideas, I'm answering these questions. You can find yourself having these little, it's like a mini dopamine rush, right? Because yes, I found the right answer, right? And I'm confident in this. And even if you're not 100% confident, right? At that point, you're saying, okay, I'm pretty sure that it's this. For the MCAT, that can also be just as good as 100% sure. And so you can get yourself almost feeling like it's a game and you get a rush out of it instead of being exhausted the entire time. Like, oh my goodness, I don't know when my next break is. I want to look at the timer, but I know if I look at the timer, I'm just going to get stressed. Turn it into something that is as engaging as possible for you. And that's going to look a little bit different for everyone, right? So like Phil mentioned, for him, it's a hunt. For me, it's okay, I need to learn something about this. Otherwise, I'm not going to be as interested. But once you find that, anchor yourself to that and use that to your advantage to help prevent some of that fatigue. And we've talked a little bit about this last time, right? Small things like, stretching, small things like taking those breaks, looking away from the screen every so often. Those are all going to help combat that fatigue that is really easy to let kind of take you over if you're not careful. And so you want to be mindful of these things as you're studying, so that way they're not worrisome on test day.
Yeah. I know we both said it, but it's a long exam. I remember the first time I took a full length exam. By the end of the exam, I felt like I'd been beaten up. Like my brain hurt, right? Like someone took a bat to my brain, and I was just like, the rest of my body, I'd done nothing. I just sat in a chair, but I am exhausted. And so my friends called and they're like, hey, do you want to hang out? And it was like 5 o'clock on a Saturday. And I'm like, no, I'm going to bed. And they're like, you're going to bed? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to bed. I'm done for the day. And then I woke up in the morning, like, you want to go to brunch? I'm like, no, I'm still recuperating. And I had a hard time recuperating from that first exam because I wasn't used to sitting and thinking really critically, actively for 7.5 hours, right? That's a long time. The day that my actual test rolled around, I finished the exam and I felt like I probably could have gone another hour and it wouldn't have been a big deal. And I think that that's also important, in terms of timing, building up that stamina, that endurance, those mental calluses to be able to deal with this fatigue. It's something that doesn't come easy and it doesn't come fast, but it comes with practice. And the more passages you do, the easier that gets, the more exams you do specifically. And I know a lot of students don't take time to specifically work on this. Most students do, but there are some students out there. I had a student that I gave him the same spiel that I'm giving right now. And then one day he was taking, I think it was his fourth exam for his prep. And he did way worse on this exam. And I'm like, what happened? He's like, well, this was the first day I did all the sections in one day. And I'm like, what? I'm like, I told you, day one, treat it like test day, emulate the exam as much as possible. Of course you did worse on this exam. And he did worse in the bio and the psych because he was just tired. Mm-hmm. I especially note that during a student's very first practice exam, whatever score they get on psych, they're probably better than what that psych score is showing, because the first time you take a practice test, by the time you get to psych, you're done, right? I'm just done for the day. Let me out of here. And so students make some silly mistakes and make some errors just because of fatigue. Generally, the more exams you take, the easier that gets with time, but you want to make sure that you are specifically practicing those things. Spending some time doing, don't study just 30 minutes in chunks, taking some time to study for a couple hours in chunks, because that'll help you build up that stamina. And then obviously, when you take a practice test, take it however you're going to take it on your exam day. If you have timing accommodations and you're taking it split over 2 days, then you should be taking your practice exam split over 2 days. If you don't have timing accommodations, you should be taking all of your practice exams in one day. It will suck, but the more of it you do, the better it will be, and it'll put you in a better spot come your actual test day.
Now I'm the one who has so much I want to say, but I also
Yeah.
want to be mindful of, just how much we've already said. Very quickly, before I forget, because this is really important, I've seen this happen a couple of times. If your testing accommodations are not yet confirmed, do not test as though you have them. Because I have seen students bank on those testing accommodations because they're used to getting them in school, and then they don't get them for the MCAT, or they get slightly different ones than what they're used to. And so
we should spend some time talking about accommodations, especially because there are some students it makes a huge difference for, but it can be harder to get. And I have some advice on like how to get those accommodations. There are students who probably deserve them, but don't get them. And maybe vice versa. And so like understanding the system and how it works is, I think, important. Maybe we'll take some time and talk about that in a session in and of itself, because that is super interesting.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that that's something that we do need to talk about. And I love that you kind of already have some ideas of navigating that system. But as we mentioned, don't assume that you already have them, because like Phil mentioned, there will be some people who deserve them and then don't end up getting them and whatnot. So test with what you know. And then if you end up getting them, fantastic, right? Then you can adjust, and it will probably be a little bit easier once you have those accommodations in place. But that's something that I think is really important, and that hurts students if they don't kind of keep that in mind. As my mom always says, you have two bags. You go with the bag of yes, and you go with the bag of no, but you got to be prepared for both. So Mom, I hope you're not watching this and listening to the little spiels that I'm including that you say. And then, so something else that I thought about was the psych-soc section. You mentioned that first time that students take their first real full length, so to speak, that psych-soc section isn't super representative of what they are actually capable of. Yes, because as much as students want to say the psych-soc section, I just need to sit down and memorize everything, there are actually a lot of questions that you can answer just kind of by reasoning your way through the material. And so it might not be as critical thinking heavy as, cars for sure, right? Or biochem, but you can still get a number of points that way. And so if you're finding yourself exhausted, it's going to make it more difficult to actually recall, right, the information that you do know, but it's also going to make it more difficult to get those easier, so to speak, questions of, I don't have to have had it memorized. I just need to be able to work through the material or use the information from the study and the passage, right? So using your, preparing how you're going to take each practice exam is really important. Plan that out beforehand. So also something that students, and I include myself in this, I definitely did this when I was first starting off, is not starting at the time that you need to start at, right? Because now some folks take it in the morning and some folks take it in the afternoon. And that wasn't really a thing when we were testing. And so making sure that you set that up from the get-go, so that way you're not suddenly flipping or changing what time you're doing your practice test as you get closer to test day. And that's something that can be a little bit more difficult and challenging when people have a lot of other things going on in their life in addition to studying for the MCAT. But as much as possible, try and keep that consistency, because it does make a difference. If you're used to, testing at 9 a.m. and then all of a sudden you realize, oh wait, I actually have an afternoon day, so I'm going to study later, but I was previously, taking it earlier so I could have my Saturday evening for friends, that will cause some shift in your scores. And so you want to maintain that stability as much as possible.
Yeah, that's one of those artifacts of COVID, allowing afternoon exams or even evening exams back when COVID was in full throw. It's not so much anymore. But I had some students that, had practice all morning, and then their exam date got canceled. All they could find was afternoons. So they took a practice in the afternoon and their score was like 4 or 5 points lower, because they weren't used to being able, or having to think critically so much later in the day. And that kind of like threw off what was going on. If you are taking your exam later in the day, it's also not a bad idea to practice and like study later in the day to get used to being mentally active during the time that you're actually taking your exam, especially as your exam approaches, like in the weeks leading up to that. And vice versa for the morning. Now I realize not everyone has like complete control of their schedule. Turns out people have jobs and managers, and people want you to come in, not when you feel like it, but when they need you to. So obviously there's some flexibility there, but for the most part, I do think it is important to understand and emulate your test day as much as possible. I did want to talk, you talked about there are those questions that just critically thinking, even in psych-soc, critically thinking, you can get answers, and students are just exhausted by then. And so a lot of times they miss some questions. In terms of timing, that's a really important thing to understand, is that sometimes stuff is in the passage in the science sections, and I'm including psych in this, sometimes it's completely from outside knowledge. And so if you find yourself short on time, like if I am in the bio section and I've got 2 passages to go and I've got 5 minutes left, and so I'm running out of time, what I'm not going to do is like start reading a passage very thoroughly. What I'm going to do is start looking at the questions, because there are questions out there that you can answer in the science sections without reading the passage. You can bring in stuff with your own knowledge. As a matter of fact, you have to bring in outside knowledge for the sciences. Now for cars, this doesn't work. Do not try to answer cars questions without reading the cars passage, because it's not going to go well. But in the sciences, that becomes a valid strategy if you find yourself scrambling. Whenever I review passages with students, I really, and I think everyone should do this, I really take time to, when we finish looking at a passage, we reviewed all the questions, we reviewed the passage. Let's take a step back and look at the questions in the passage together. So let's say there were 5 questions with this passage. One of the questions required you to use this table. One of the questions required you to use this sentence in the first paragraph. And 3 of the questions came from nowhere in the passage. It came from your own head. And so if you were running out of time, you could answer 60% of those questions without reading the passage. And that's really good, right? Like especially if you're running out of time and you've only got enough time to do a little bit, you don't get any points for reading the passage well. You get points for answering questions. And if you can answer some questions without reading the passages, which you can do in the sciences, take advantage of that if you're running out of time. If you've got 2 passages left and you've got 25 minutes, read the passages, do the questions. But it's nice to have that as a plan B, and reminder that works in Chem Phys, Bio, Psych Soc, pretty much everywhere except for cars.
And just to kind of wrap us up, you mentioned before, after you take a full length, right, which questions you definitely want to focus on. The ones that you didn't even get to see, go ahead and if you didn't even get to see them, read the passage afterwards, right? And try and answer them and see how you do. Even if you kind of guessed on the last few, if they were pseudo-discretes, and that's what Phil's referring to, they don't require information from the passage. If you answered them, still review them. You still want to go through them as though you had the full time to answer them, just knowing that you didn't have that full time for the pseudo-discretes, right? If those were the ones you were answering, but definitely go ahead and give those questions that you didn't get to look at all a chance as well. All right. Well, we look forward to getting to chat with you guys next time. And thank you for sitting with us and taking the time to listen to us.